The candles in the great hall at Marchmont Court had burned low by the time the Duke of Carriage rose from the head of the table and made the announcement that would end his marriage in everything but name, though not a single guest seated along that gleaming mahogany expanse yet understood what they were witnessing. He stood with a goblet of claret in one hand and an expression of practiced boredom that did nothing to disguise the calculation beneath it, and he informed the assembled company, some 40 of the finest families in the county, that his companion of recent months, a woman introduced only as Mrs. Breck, Vance, would henceforth be shown the deference due a lady of the house, and that his wife, the Duchess herself, seated at the far end of that same table in a gown the colour of winter roses, would rise and greet Mrs. Vance with the courtesy of an equal. The room went so silent that the guttering of the candles became audible, 40 pairs of eyes swinging from the Duke to his wife and back again, waiting to see whether Eleanor Carriage, who had endured 3 years of quiet humiliations behind closed doors, would finally break in front of witnesses the way her husband had clearly designed this moment to make her break. She did not break. She rose from her chair with a composure that made the room feel colder than the October night outside, and in a voice that carried to every corner of that hall without ever once rising above a conversational register, she informed her husband that she would not be bowing to anyone in her own home, that she required her carriage brought around within the half hour, and that he could explain to his guests, in whatever manner he found convenient, precisely why his wife had chosen to leave her own dinner table, rather than comply with a demand that would have made her complicit in her own disgrace. What the Duke did not know, standing there with his claret going warm in his hand, while his wife swept toward the door without a single backward glance, was that Eleanor's carriage had been packed and waiting in the stable-yard for nearly a fortnight, that she had spent those 2 weeks quietly moving what remained of her own inheritance out of accounts he controlled, and that the woman he had just tried to humiliate in front of the entire county was walking out of Marchmont Court that night, carrying with her a piece of knowledge about his affairs, both financial and otherwise. That would take him the better part of a year to even begin to understand the danger of. Before we return to the beginning of this story, to the quiet country wedding that once made Eleanor believe she had found a partner rather than a jailer, I want to ask you to stay with me through everything that follows, because the woman who stepped into that carriage that night was not fleeing in defeat. She was beginning something the Duke would spend years trying and failing to stop. And, if tales of quiet women who refuse to be broken keep your evenings good company, consider staying subscribed for what comes next, because it is considerably more satisfying than anything that dinner table witnessed. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a spring morning 8 years earlier, when a young woman named Eleanor Marsh first arrived at Marchmont Court, believing she had been chosen rather than acquired. Eleanor Marsh had been the daughter of a modestly prosperous wool merchant from the north, educated well beyond what her station strictly required, because her father, a widower who doted on his only child, had believed firmly that a sharp mind was worth more than a fashionable one, regardless of what society expected of young women. She had grown up, reading her father's ledgers as readily as her novels, understanding by the age of 16 how credit moved through a business, and how quickly a fortune could unravel if it was managed by fools, and this unusual education had made her, by the time she was presented in local society at 19 planks, a young woman whose conversation was considerably more interesting than her dowry, which was respectable but hardly spectacular by the standards of the peerage. It was at an assembly in York that she first caught the eye of Julian Ashford, then merely the heir to the dukedom of Carriage rather than its holder, a man whose charm in those early days seemed to Eleanor like the answer to every quiet hope she had never quite dared to voice aloud. He was handsome in the effortless way of men who had never needed to try, attentive in a manner that made her feel, for the first time in her sheltered life, genuinely seen. And when he began calling on her father's house with a frequency that soon became the subject of considerable local speculation, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that she had found not merely an advantageous match, but something rarer, a genuine partnership between two minds that might actually suit each other. Her father, though pleased at the prospect of his daughter's elevation, was not so dazzled by a ducal courtship that he failed to notice certain details that troubled him, and in the weeks before the wedding he took Eleanor aside more than once to express a caution she was too much in love to properly hear. He told her that a man who spoke so easily of devotion before marriage sometimes discovered that devotion required rather more effort to sustain once the courtship was won, and he told her, in the careful, indirect way of a father who did not wish to wound his daughter's happiness, that he had heard certain things about Julian's habits from acquaintances in London that gave him pause, mentions of a woman named Cordelia Vance, who had featured in Julian's life for some years before Eleanor had ever entered it. Diner actress, some notoriety, whom Julian was rumoured to have kept as a mistress since well before he had ever attended that assembly in York. Eleanor, 19, and thoroughly convinced of her own understanding of the man she loved, dismissed her father's concerns as the natural anxiety of a parent losing his only child to a world he did not fully understand, and told him, with the confidence of the young and the besotted, that whatever arrangements Julian might have maintained before their courtship began were surely a closed chapter now that he had chosen her. The wedding held at Marchmont Court itself, with a grandeur that overwhelmed Eleanor's more modest sensibilities, seemed at first to confirm every hope she had carried into the marriage. Julian was attentive through the early months, proud to display his new Duchess at gatherings across the county. And Eleanor, settling into the enormous house that was now hers to manage, threw herself into the work of learning its intricate systems of staff and tenant and estate with the same careful diligence she had once applied to her father's ledgers. Quickly earning the quiet respect of a household staff who had seen previous mistresses come and go without ever bothering to learn their names. It was perhaps 18 months into the marriage, after the birth of their first child, a daughter named Beatrice, that Eleanor first began to notice the subtle changes in her husband's attention, the evenings that stretched later without explanation, the trips to London that grew more frequent and less clearly justified, the way certain letters arrived for him that he read in his study with the door firmly closed and never once mentioned to her afterward. She told herself, as women in her position had told themselves for generations before her, that the demands of managing a great estate simply required more of a duke's time than courtship ever had. And she buried her growing unease beneath the daily business of raising a daughter and managing a household that seemed to grow more complicated with every passing season. The truth, when it finally reached her, arrived not through any confession from her husband, but through the careless remark of a woman she had considered a friend, Lady Beaumont, who mentioned in passing during a visit to Marchmont Court that she had seen the Duke at the opera in London the previous month. Seated in a private box with a woman everyone in the capital recognized immediately, the same Cordelia Vance whose name Eleanor's father had once tried gently to warn her about. Lady Beaumont, realizing too late that this was information Eleanor did not already possess, attempted a hasty and unconvincing retraction, but the damage, if it could be called damage, after nearly 2 years of unspoken suspicion, had already been done. And Eleanor found herself that same evening confronting her husband in his study with a directness that surprised them both. Julian did not deny it. He seemed, if anything, almost relieved to have the pretense abandoned, and told his wife with a bluntness that would characterize the entire remainder of their marriage that Cordelia Vance had been a fixture in his life since before he had ever met Eleanor, that he saw no particular reason to abandon an arrangement that suited him simply because he had also married, that Eleanor, if she possessed any sense at all, would learn to accept this reality the way generations of aristocratic wives before her had learned to accept the same arrangement in their own marriages, quietly, without scenes, and without any expectation that a duke's private conduct required his wife's approval. It was in this conversation, more than in any subsequent cruelty, that Eleanor first understood the true shape of the life she had entered, and it was here, too, that the quiet, careful resourcefulness her father had cultivated in her since childhood began, almost without her fully realizing it at first. to reassert itself as her primary defense against a situation she could not simply leave. Divorce, for a woman of her station in that era, was a catastrophe that would cost her not merely her position, but very likely her daughter as well, the law and society alike overwhelmingly favoring a husband's custody, regardless of the grounds for separation. And Eleanor understood, with a clarity that frightened her, exactly how little power she actually held within the marriage she had entered so hopefully 8 years before this story's opening scene. But understanding her powerlessness within the existing structure of her marriage was not the same as accepting it permanently. And in the months following that devastating conversation in Julian's study, Eleanor Callowbridge began, quietly and with a patience that would define the next several years of her life, to build something her husband never once suspected her capable of, a private and independent understanding of exactly how the Callowbridge fortune actually functioned, where its vulnerabilities lay, and what leverage, if any, a woman in her position might eventually be able to exercise. She began small, asking careful questions of the estate's steward under the guise of simple domestic curiosity, questions about which tenants paid their rents reliably and which struggled, which investments the previous duke had made, and which Julian himself had pursued since inheriting the title, which debts the estate carried, and to whom. The steward, a practical man named Mr. Holloway, who had served the family for 20 years, and who had watched with quiet disapproval as the young Duchess was increasingly sidelined from any real influence over the household she nominally governed, found himself, almost without deciding to, becoming an ally to Eleanor's careful education, answering her questions honestly and even, on occasion, showing her ledgers that Julian himself rarely bothered to examine closely, trusting the tedious business of estate management to men he considered beneath his direct attention. Over the following years, as Julian's affair with Cordelia Vance continued with ever less discretion and his neglect of Eleanor grew correspondingly more pronounced, Eleanor built, piece by careful piece, a private understanding of the Callowbridge finances that eventually exceeded her husband's own, an understanding she shared with absolutely no one. Not even Mr. Holloway, whose loyalty she trusted, but whose discretion she was unwilling to test with the full scope of what she was actually planning. What she discovered over those quiet years of careful study was troubling in ways that went well beyond her husband's infidelity. Julian, it emerged, had been making increasingly reckless investments in speculative ventures, encouraged by a circle of London friends whose own fortunes were built on considerably thinner foundations than they liked to advertise, and financing a portion of these ventures, along with the increasingly lavish lifestyle he maintained for Cordelia Vance in a townhouse he had purchased for her under a name that did not immediately connect to his own, through debts secured against portions of the Callowbridge estate that had never before been mortgaged in the family's 300-year history. Eleanor understood, with a coldness that surprised even herself, that her husband was slowly gambling away not merely her own security, but their daughter's inheritance, and that the very isolation from estate affairs he had imposed upon her as a means of control was simultaneously the thing that would allow her eventually to act against him without his ever suspecting the extent of her knowledge until it was far too late for him to counter it. It was during this same period, roughly 5 years into the marriage and 3 years before the dinner party that opens this story, that Eleanor made the acquaintance of a woman who would become perhaps the single most important ally in everything that followed, a widowed cousin of her own mother's family named Mrs. Prudence Talbot, who arrived at Marchmont Court for an extended visit following the death of her husband, a solicitor, whose practice in London had specialized among other things in matters of estate and inheritance law as they pertained to women whose fortunes had been mismanaged or misappropriated by careless or cruel husbands. Mrs. Talbot, sharp-eyed and entirely without illusions about the marriage she witnessed unfolding around her during that visit, recognized in Eleanor a woman of considerable untapped capability being systematically diminished by a husband who mistook her quiet composure for simple resignation. and over the course of several long conversations conducted in the privacy of Eleanor's private sitting room, the older woman began to explain to Eleanor precisely what legal and financial protections existed, however limited, for a wife in her position, and precisely how a clever woman might, over time, position herself to exercise whatever leverage those protections allowed. It was Mrs. Dal, Mrs. Mai Talbot who first suggested the idea that would eventually prove central to everything Eleanor accomplished, the observation that Eleanor's own inheritance from her father, a considerable sum that had been placed in trust at the time of her marriage, rather than transferred entirely to her husband's control. Provision her father had insisted upon despite Julian's initial objections, remained legally hers to direct within certain limits, and that a woman who understood the actual mechanics of that trust, rather than simply accepting her husband's assurances about its management, might discover opportunities her husband had never imagined she would think to pursue. Eleanor, who had not given serious thought to her own trust in years, having assumed, like most women of her station, that such matters were properly the province of her husband and his solicitors, found in Mrs. Cumberry Talbot's suggestion the seed of a plan that would occupy the following 3 years of her life, with a purpose she had not felt since the earliest, most hopeful days of her courtship, though this time the purpose was not romantic hope, but something colder and more durable, the slow, careful construction of an independence her husband believed he had made entirely impossible. Over those 3 years, working through correspondence with a solicitor, Mrs. Talbot recommended a careful and discreet man named Mr. Ferris, who had no prior connection to the Callowbridge family, and therefore no divided loyalties to complicate his service. Eleanor began systematically reviewing the terms of her marriage settlement and her father's trust, discovering in the process several provisions that Julian's own solicitors, focused as they were on the Duke's interests rather than the Duchess's, had never troubled to explain to her in any detail. She learned that her father, in a final act of the same protective foresight that had once tried and failed to warn her away from this marriage entirely, had structured her trust with unusual care, ensuring that while the income from it could be directed toward household expenses at her discretion, the principal itself remained beyond her husband's reach, entirely accessible only to Eleanor herself, or, in the event of her death, to their daughter Beatrice. This single provision, buried in legal language that had gone essentially unexamined for 8 years of marriage, would prove to be the foundation of everything Eleanor built afterward, and its discovery marked the moment when her quiet resourcefulness began transforming from simple self-protection into something considerably more ambitious. It was around this same time, roughly 2 years before the dinner party at Marchmont Court, that Cordelia Vance herself, whom Eleanor had until then known only as an abstract source of humiliation rather than an actual person, began making choices that would inadvertently hand Eleanor an additional and unexpected advantage. Cordelia, growing bolder as Julian's devotion to her deepened and his attention to his actual wife correspondingly diminished, began pressing Julian for greater public acknowledgement. Weary of the shadows and discretion that had defined their arrangement for nearly a decade. Weak in the particular way of men who have never had to face genuine consequence for their choices, found himself increasingly unable to refuse her demands even as they grew more reckless and more visible. It was Cordelia's growing boldness, in fact, that would eventually produce the demand at that fateful dinner party, an escalation that Eleanor, watching from her position of carefully cultivated invisibility within her own household, observed with a patience that concealed just how thoroughly she had already begun preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, though even Eleanor could not have predicted in those early months of watching Cordelia's growing confidence quite how far her husband would eventually be willing to go in service of a mistress whose hold over him seemed to strengthen in direct proportion to his own increasing recklessness. The specific catalyst for the dinner party demand, as Eleanor would later piece together through Mrs. Talbot's London connections and Mr. Holloway's careful observations of the Duke's private correspondence was a debt Julian had accumulated to a group of increasingly impatient creditors in London, men whose patience had been extended for years on the strength of his title and expectations, but who had finally begun demanding actual repayment as their own financial circumstances grew more precarious. Cordelia, learning of this pressure and sensing an opportunity to secure her own position more permanently against the possibility that financial catastrophe might eventually force Julian to abandon their arrangement, had begun insisting that Julian formalize her status in some manner that would protect her interests, regardless of what happened to his marriage or his finances, and the demand that Eleanor bow to her at that dinner table, humiliating and unprecedented as it was, represented Julian's attempt to satisfy his mistress's escalating demands through the cheapest possible currency available to him, his wife's public dignity, rather than through the money he no longer reliably possessed. What Julian did not know, and would not discover until it was entirely too late to prevent the consequences, was that Eleanor had spent the preceding 18 months working entirely through Mr. Ferris, and, without any direct communication that might have alerted her husband to her activities, quietly and legally moving the principal of her trust into a series of independent investments, entirely separate from anything connected to the Callowbridge estate, building through careful and patient management. While considerably smaller than the ducal wealth she had married into, was entirely her own, unencumbered by any of her husband's debts, and entirely beyond his ability to touch or control. She had done this, not with any specific plan for the dramatic confrontation that would eventually unfold at that dinner table, but simply because Mrs. Nartey Talbot's careful counsel had taught her that a woman's only true security lay in resources that belonged to her alone, and because the slow accumulation of that independence had given Eleanor, for the first time in years, a sense of agency over her own future that she had genuinely believed impossible when she first learned the truth about her husband's infidelity all those years before. The dinner party itself, when it finally arrived on that October evening, had been planned by Julian for weeks as an occasion to introduce Cordelia to county society under circumstances designed to normalize her presence gradually, beginning with smaller gatherings before building, he hoped, to full public acceptance over the following year. Eleanor had known of the planned introduction for some time. Mr. Holloway, having overheard enough of Julian's private correspondence with his London solicitor to piece together the general shape of what was being planned. But she had not known until the moment Julian actually rose from his chair and made his demand in front of 40 witnesses. Exactly how far he intended to push the humiliation on this particular evening, nor had she fully anticipated that he would choose to stage the confrontation with such theatrical cruelty, clearly calculating that Eleanor's horror of public scandal would force her compliance, regardless of her private feelings on the matter. He had in this calculation profoundly misjudged the woman he had married, a miscalculation that would define everything that followed, and that Eleanor, walking toward her waiting carriage through the cold October darkness, with her maid hurrying behind her, carrying the last of the belongings she had quietly prepared over the preceding fortnight, understood with a clarity that felt, after 8 years of careful patience, almost like relief. She did not weep in that carriage, though her maid, a devoted young woman named Susan, who had served Eleanor since the earliest days of the marriage, and who understood better than almost anyone the true cost of the composure her mistress had maintained for so many years, wept quietly enough for both of them as the carriage rattled away from Marchmont Court into the darkness. Eleanor sat instead with a stillness that Susan would later describe to her own children as the calmest she had ever seen anyone in the midst of what should have been the worst night of their life. And it was this stillness, this refusal to be broken, exactly when her husband had most expected it. That would prove to be the first and most important victory in a war that Julian Callowbridge did not yet even know he had started. The carriage carried Eleanor and her daughter Beatrice, now 7 years old, and confused by the sudden nighttime departure from the only home she had ever known, not to some hastily arranged inn or to the mercy of distant relations, but to a modest, comfortable townhouse in a respectable but unfashionable district of London that Eleanor had quietly purchased 8 months earlier using funds from her independent trust, a property whose existence Julian had absolutely no knowledge of and whose deed was registered under a name, Eleanor Marsh, that deliberately obscured any immediate connection to the Duke she had just publicly abandoned. It was here, this modest house, that represented the first truly independent decision of Eleanor's adult life, that she and Beatrice settled in the weeks following the dinner party, while London society buzzed with a scandal that grew more elaborate with every retelling, and while Julian Calabridge, humiliated in front of his own guests and now facing the very public departure of a wife he had genuinely believed would swallow any indignity rather than risk the scandal of leaving him, began to understand, far too late, that he had badly underestimated the woman he had spent 8 years dismissing as unremarkable. The weeks following Eleanor's departure from Marchmont Court proved considerably more difficult for Julian than he had anticipated in the immediate aftermath of his triumphant, cruel announcement. County society, which he had expected to view Eleanor's departure as confirmation of her inadequacy as a wife, instead began, slowly and then with gathering momentum, to view the entire episode as evidence of the Duke's own poor character, a shift in sentiment that Julian, accustomed to society's general deference toward his title, found both baffling and increasingly alarming as invitations to events he had once taken for granted began arriving with noticeably less frequency. Cordelia Vance, for her part, discovered that the public acknowledgement she had craved for years brought with it a scrutiny considerably less flattering than she had imagined, as the same society that might once have quietly tolerated a discreet arrangement now openly discussed her as the woman who had driven a duchess from her own dinner table, a reputation that made the full social acceptance she had hoped for seem with each passing month further away rather than closer. It was into this atmosphere of growing scandal and social uncertainty that Mr. Setmesty Ferris, acting on Eleanor's careful instructions, delivered the first indication to Julian's own solicitors that the Duchess intended to pursue a formal separation, along with terms regarding Beatrice's custody and Eleanor's ongoing financial independence that were considerably more assertive than anything Julian's legal advisers had prepared him to expect from a wife they had assumed, based on 8 years of quiet compliance, would be easily managed through the usual channels of aristocratic pressure and social consequence. Julian, confronted with legal demands that revealed a depth of financial and legal understanding he had never once suspected his wife of possessing, found himself asking his own solicitors with a mounting alarm that Eleanor would have found deeply satisfying had she been present to witness it. Exactly how his wife had come to understand the intricate details of his estate's debts and investments with a precision that seemed, in places, to exceed his own solicitor's knowledge. And it was here, in this moment of dawning and unwelcome realization, that Julian Calabridge first began to suspect that the woman he had married 8 years earlier as a pleasant but unremarkable choice had spent the intervening years becoming someone he had never troubled to actually know, a mistake he would spend the following year attempting with increasing desperation to correct, though by then, as the coming chapters of this story will reveal, the woman he was trying to understand had already moved several steps beyond any position from which he could hope to reassert the control he had once taken entirely for granted. Julian's first response to the mounting pressure of Eleanor's legal maneuvering was, predictably for a man of his temperament, an attempt to reassert control through the social and legal advantages his title still afforded him, and he instructed his solicitors to pursue an aggressive counterposition, calculating correctly that a threat to separate Eleanor from her daughter represented the single point of leverage most likely to force her back into compliance, regardless of whatever financial independence she had managed to secure. This calculation, delivered to Eleanor through a formal letter from Julian's solicitors within a month of her departure, represented the first moment since the dinner party itself when her carefully maintained composure came genuinely close to cracking, and it was Mrs. Closter, Talbot, summoned urgently to the London townhouse, who helped Eleanor understand that this threat, however frightening, was considerably weaker than Julian's solicitors were representing it to be, given both the scandal Julian himself had created through his public treatment of his wife and the growing body of evidence, which Mr. Bree Ferris had been quietly compiling for months regarding the extent of Julian's financial recklessness and the specific circumstances of his relationship with Cordelia Vance. It was during this tense period, as both sides prepared for what threatened to become a protracted and increasingly public legal battle, that Eleanor received an unexpected visitor at her London townhouse, a woman she had not seen or heard from in years and had genuinely believed she would never encounter again under any circumstances. Cordelia Vance herself, arriving alone and without any prior warning on a grey afternoon in early winter, her usual poise noticeably diminished, and her expression carrying an anxiety that Eleanor, watching from the window as the unfamiliar carriage arrived, found herself genuinely curious to understand. Cordelia once admitted, wasted little time on pleasantries, informing Eleanor with a bluntness that suggested considerable desperation that Julian's financial situation had deteriorated far beyond what even Eleanor's careful investigations had yet uncovered. That his London creditors had grown sufficiently impatient to threaten legal action that would expose not merely his debts, but the full and humiliating details of exactly how those debts had been accumulated, and that Cordelia herself, having spent nearly a decade building her position on the assumption of Julian's protection, now found herself facing the very real possibility that his ruin would leave her with nothing at all to show for years of a relationship society had never fully accepted, and that she now recognized had been built on foundations considerably less stable than she had allowed herself to believe. This confession, delivered by the very woman whose demands had precipitated Eleanor's departure from Marchmont Court in the first place, presented Eleanor with a choice considerably more complicated than simple vindication or vengeance, and it is here, in this unexpected meeting between two women whom the same man had wronged in entirely different ways, that the true shape of what Eleanor intended to build from the wreckage of her marriage finally began to emerge, though what she chose to do with Cordelia's desperate confession and what it revealed about the full extent of Julian's financial catastrophe would prove to have consequences neither woman sitting in that London drawing room could have fully anticipated, setting in motion a chain of events that would determine not only the final resolution of Eleanor's marriage, but the future of Marchmont Court itself and the fate of the daughter both women, in their own very different ways, had reason to care about protecting. Eleanor listened to Cordelia's confession with a stillness that unnerved her visitor considerably more than anger would have, and when she finally spoke, it was not to offer the comfort Cordelia had perhaps unconsciously hoped for, nor the cold dismissal she might reasonably have expected, but a series of careful, precise questions about the exact nature and scale of Julian's debts, questions that revealed to Cordelia, as they had once revealed to Julian's own alarmed solicitors, that the woman she had helped humiliate at that dinner table possessed a grasp of financial detail considerably more sophisticated than anything she had been led to expect from a duchess, whose primary function in the world Cordelia had always understood was decorative rather than substantive. Cordelia, understanding quickly that her only remaining path to any security lay in cooperation rather than continued rivalry, provided Eleanor with details that Mr. Ferris's careful investigations had not yet uncovered: specific names of London creditors, exact figures regarding the townhouse Julian had purchased for her and the debt secured against it, and perhaps most significantly, an account of a particular investment scheme. Paul. Speculative venture in colonial trading concerns that several of Julian's London friends had convinced him to enter, using Marchmont Court's own agricultural income as collateral, a scheme that had already begun to fail in ways that threatened not merely Julian's personal fortune, but the very ancestral estate that gave the Callowbridge title its meaning. Armed with this information, Eleanor understood that she now possessed something considerably more valuable than simple grounds for separation. a complete and detailed picture of exactly how vulnerable her husband's position truly was. Vulnerability that extended not just to his relationship with Cordelia or his treatment of his wife, but to the very foundation of wealth and land that had defined the Carriage family for centuries. It was Mrs. Talbot, once again providing the crucial strategic counsel that had guided Eleanor through the preceding years, who helped her understand the full implications of this knowledge, explaining that Eleanor now held not merely a strong hand in negotiating the terms of her own separation and custody arrangements, but genuine leverage over the survival of Marchmont Court itself, leverage that could, if Eleanor chose to use it, transform the entire negotiation from a defensive battle over what she might be permitted to keep into an offensive position, from which she might dictate terms that Julian, facing the potential total collapse of his estate and title, would have little practical choice but to accept. The negotiations that followed over the subsequent months were conducted almost entirely through solicitors, Eleanor and Julian never once meeting face-to-face throughout the process, a distance that Eleanor insisted upon and that Julian, increasingly desperate as his creditors' patience continued to fray and as word of his financial troubles began circulating through the same London circles that had once celebrated his easy charm, found himself with diminishing power to resist. The final settlement, when it was eventually reached nearly a year after that fateful dinner party, granted Eleanor full and formal custody of Beatrice, a generous ongoing income secured against what remained of the Carriage estate's more stable assets, and, in a provision that Julian's solicitors fought bitterly, but ultimately could not prevent, given the full weight of evidence regarding his financial recklessness that Eleanor's legal team was prepared to make public, if necessary. A controlling interest in the specific agricultural income and land management decisions that would determine whether Marchmont Court survived its owner's speculative disasters or was lost entirely to the same creditors who had grown so dangerously impatient. Julian Carriage, in the end, kept his title and the diminished shell of an estate he had very nearly destroyed through his own recklessness and cruelty, but he kept it only through terms that placed the actual management of Marchmont Court's finances under the practical control of the wife he had once demanded bow before his mistress. A reversal so complete that county society, watching the details of the settlement gradually become known through the usual channels of aristocratic gossip, spoke of little else for the better part of a season. Cordelia Vance, whose confession had proven so instrumental in shaping the final outcome, received from Eleanor, in a private arrangement that owed nothing to any formal legal obligation and everything to Eleanor's own private sense of what fairness required, given the woman's unexpected cooperation, a modest but sufficient settlement that allowed her to establish an independent life away from London society's judgment, a kindness that Cordelia had not expected and that she would later describe, in letters to a cousin in the north, as the only genuine mercy anyone had shown her in the entire painful affair. Eleanor and Beatrice settled permanently into the London townhouse that had once been Eleanor's secret preparation for exactly this eventual independence, though within 2 years the success of Eleanor's careful management of the Carriage agricultural income, work she conducted through Mr. Pellenan, Holloway, and a growing network of her own trusted advisers, rather than through any restored relationship with her former husband, had grown sufficiently well regarded in London financial circles that she found herself remarkably sought after as a source of practical counsel by other women in similarly precarious marital circumstances. Women who had heard the story of the Duchess who called for her carriage rather than bow to her husband's mistress, and who recognized in Eleanor someone who understood in a way few could, exactly how a woman without obvious power might nonetheless build something entirely her own from the wreckage of a marriage designed to diminish her. Beatrice grew up dividing her time between her mother's London household and occasional carefully supervised visits to her father at Marchmont Court, visits that Julian, chastened by everything he had lost and was still in the process of losing, approached with a humility that surprised everyone who had known him during the arrogant years of his marriage. And though he and Eleanor never spoke again with anything resembling warmth, The icy formality of their remaining dealings represented, for Eleanor, not a wound still open, but simply the closed final chapter of a life she had built, the strength to leave behind, a strength that had begun. Though neither she nor anyone watching that dinner table could have known it at the time, in the quiet, deliberate moment when she rose from her chair, refused the demand that would have made her complicit in her own disgrace, and called, in a voice that never once wavered, for her carriage to be brought around.